Greetings, loyal listeners and new recruits. I'm Drew Deach.
I'm Travis Newton.
And this is Genre Vision. Every week, Travis and I review and recommend horror films, action movies, fantasy flicks, sci-fi cinema, and more. And this week, we're putting out fire with gasoline. That's what I love to hear. Yes, it is Cat People from 1942 versus Cat People from 1982. Before we do that, just a couple quick calls to action. First and foremost, Travis, I think we have a new review about our other show, Finflix, that you have up and ready to read.
Yeah, this review comes to us from listener Meerkat Marco. Mr. Marco says, "Thanks, guys. 5 stars. Top-notch analysis, great banter, catchy theme song, and of all podcasts to listen to during a global pandemic, I would recommend this one the most."
Aw, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for mentioning the theme song. It's still one of the absolute favorite creative endeavors I've ever been a part of in my life.
It was one of my favorite collaborations with you, Drew, and I'm glad you all can listen to it. And speaking of Finflix, we actually have a new episode of that coming out in the next couple of weeks. As always, our Patreon subscribers will get it sooner and in its uncut form, and it's all about the movie Alligator from 1980. I eagerly await the release of that episode, and I hope you do too.
Yeah, so if you want to hear it early and hear the uncut version where we also talk about the sequel, Alligator 2, The Mutation, you can go to patreon.com/genrevision and become a premium member for $5 a month or a Finflix member for $2 a month, which will get you access to the Finflix bonus material. The premium tier gets you access to all the bonus material that we do for all the Genre Vision shows, including pre-show discussions, and we've got something in the can also that's going to be Patreon exclusive that we will probably be sharing next week. And speaking of Patreon, we just got, as we're recording this, a brand new patron, loyal listener. Seen him pop up in the comments. Thank you so very, very much, Eric. Our Patreon subscribers are keeping the show alive. Thank you so much, Eric, for becoming a premium subscriber over at patreon.com/genrevision.
And as luck would have it, Eric has also left us a new review on Apple Podcasts as well. Eric says, "Zardoz, 5 stars. I like to think that I'm personally responsible for this episode. Only goes to prove that you cannot review 2 John Boorman movies with neither of them being Zardoz and expect to escape unscathed. Drew and Travis both perform admirably in this episode and indeed all of their podcast episodes. Eric, words can't express how thankful I am that you enjoyed our Zardoz episode. It sounds like you enjoyed it just as much as we did."
And last but certainly not least, Travis put up a video on the YouTube channel, youtube.com/genrevision. Travis, this was your kind of little pet project, and I'm very, very happy to see it.
I wanted to make something quick and simple. It's up on the Genre Vision YouTube page now. And as Drew and I were sitting here doing the pre-show for today's episode, we got a comment on it from listener Mr. Fu. Mr. Fu says, "I am still shocked this YouTube channel is under 1,000 subscribers. Did one of you date and cheat on a Google engineer or something? It was a breath of fresh air just to see this video not be some affiliate link stuffed tech review and actually provide something useful for people." Mr. Fu, thank you so much. Hopefully you do hear us read your comment out loud. This made my day brighter.
All right, let's get feline up in here. We're starting with Cat People from 1942, directed by Jacques Tourneur. I said that as Frenchy as I possibly could.
You could say Tourneur.
Okay. And who is no stranger to the show. We covered his film Curse of the Demon, which is also known as Night of the Demon. Go listen to that episode, and more importantly, watch that movie. It's great.
It's a real good one.
This is produced by Val Lewton from the good folks at RKO, which for the longest time I only knew about as a studio because of their referencing in Rocky Horror Picture Show. And Cat People is a movie I've always heard about, not just because I was familiar with the remake, which we're going to talk about, but it was always very revered from a position of how to do a relatively low budget horror movie for the era. Both Travis and I had never seen it before. And after seeing Cat People, honestly, the praise that I was aware of may not have been sufficient enough. I think Cat People 1942 is, I mean, it's obviously a classic at this point. It's an entry in the Criterion Collection, but man, this is a ridiculously good movie.
It's a stone cold classic. And I had seen it for years mentioned on all sorts of compilation type media, like Scariest Movie Moments, I think it's listed on there. They talk about some of the suspense scenes from this movie being some of the scariest movie moments of all time. And now I see why. In context, these scenes that I had glimpsed before in passing, watching these TV shows, is like, oh wow, okay, yeah, they were onto something. This is really good. It's also short. This is a 73-minute movie, and it makes a whole lot of good use of those 73 minutes.
Not a wasted second, in my opinion. The story follows this woman, Irina, who I believe when we first meet her, her name is Irina Dubrovna.
She's a Serbian immigrant in New York City.
And she's hanging out at this big cat enclosure. And there's this Black Panther that she seems particularly drawn to. And I think she's actually drawing it. She's kind of like a fashion designer.
Yeah, she illustrates dress designs and stuff like that. But she is glimpsed by this man who, oddly enough, is named Oliver Reed.
played by Kent Smith. Should say Irina's played by Simone Simon. And there's kind of an immediate attraction. And what's interesting about this interplay, because you can kind of know from the era and what to expect with certain dynamics between particularly male and female leads. I like that this movie is thinking about that in a bigger sense. We're going to talk a little bit later, I think, about what some of its overarching targets are, but it's clear that it wants to address the idea of relationships and passion and what that means, because we discover that Irina kind of holds back in her romantic feelings, and we'll find out why that is. It might have something to do with the title.
But she's also oddly aggressive early on in the film. She meets Oliver at the zoo, when she's looking at this panther, and she's very forward with him. She invites him over to her apartment, and as they get to her front door, she invites him in for tea right after meeting the guy. And you can tell, like, she's being, like, alarmingly forward for somebody in a movie released in 1942. And I'm not trying to put a judgment call on this woman for being this kind of forward with what she wants. As a matter of fact, I think that's pretty interesting and pretty cool for a movie of the time. But you get that sense immediately, like, oh, this movie's actually playing it not quite so safe. It's not enforcing certain norms that you would expect a movie of the time to enforce.
Because it's very directly commenting on those norms. When Irina brings him in, he sees this little statue of a man on horseback holding a sword. I think somebody's like impaled on the sword.
A cat is impaled on the sword.
Yes, and this statue appears in the opening credits of the movie. And we find out that this is King John of Serbia, who came into her village hundreds of years ago and wiped out this basically a tribe of wicked people.
Sorry, all I'm imagining is that fucking painting from the latest episode of What We Do in the Shadows.
Right, yeah.
with Nadja's village. Sorry.
And it's clear she talks direct. I mean, she directly brings up, like, yes, King John brought Christianity to our village and purged it of all these evil, heathenistic people. And it's like, okay, I don't think that's how this movie feels. That it's clearly commenting about this, and we soon find out that it's because these people were apparently shapeshifters who could change into giant cats, and Irina believes this 100%. She thinks that this is not just some folktale or anything, and that it's soon revealed that her reasons for being kind of guarded with her passion is because she believes that if she gives in to passion, if she even kisses a man that she's in love with, she will turn into a cat.
Yeah. By 15 minutes into this movie, like I said, pretty short movie. By 15 minutes in, they're married. Oliver is head over heels in love with Irina. She doesn't want to give in to her very apparent physical passions. There's this really interesting scene early on, right after he comes over for tea, before they get married. They're sitting together in her dark apartment because they've just, fallen for each other so quickly that they can just sit around and do nothing together and wait till it gets dark. And she can hear the lions roaring in the zoo from her apartment window. And it's like, she's Dracula right now, doing the whole, what sweet music they make.
She says that, some people complain that it keeps them up. She says, I like it. And she specifically talks about the panther and how it's like, it sounds like she screams like a woman.
Yeah.
And it's like, this is weird. Like, it's very lyrical, but not in such a magical Cocteau way. It's so evocative, especially for a movie from this era. And it's also clear that the movie has a very, very definitive message about Puritanism.
It does, and it also has a really interesting approach to perspective with its characters, because in so many stories you would seek to find refuge in a single perspective. You would be Oliver in some stories, being on the outsider looking in on Irina's life and allowing her to sort of be a mystery. But the movie actually splits its perspective up and makes Irina, I think, the perspective character most of the time. Obviously I didn't time it out, but the fact that she remains such a central perspective in the film makes her very, very sympathetic. Even though eventually we come to know that this whole cat people thing she believes is real, the fact that it stays with her and we understand her sort of descent into anger and feelings of betrayal, that stuff is not designed to make her out to be the villain. She's definitely sympathetic. Even the person we think that could be viewed as a villain or like an interloper into their relationship is also likable and sympathetic.
It's because the movie's talking about the idea of sexual repression, and not just sexual, but I think just repressing anything that is seen as not perfectly moral and Christian and good and collected.
Basically, it's about a woman afraid of her own emotions and passion. It's a fear of hysteria thing.
And what's interesting is that this is released in 1942. This is 4 years after the implementation of the infamous Hays Code, which the short version is it was kind of the first ratings approach to movies. There weren't ratings, but the Hays Code had rules of like, you can't show this, and this in your movies, or they won't screen, we won't approve them. And it was because in the 30s, there were a lot of movies, particularly horror movies, that were showcasing some really intense stuff for the era. Look up pre-code horror movies and you'll find some really great stuff. And it's very clear that everybody involved, and I would say particularly the screenwriter DeWitt Bodine, is using this story to take a shot at the idea of the Hays Code by saying, look, if you're going to think that the best approach is to repress all of these kind of wilder elements in not only fiction, but in real life, the only thing that can happen is eventually it's going to come out and it's going to be way worse for having repressed it. Mm-hmm. And that's very clear because eventually, as the movie goes on, because Irina and her husband Oliver don't even sleep in the same bedroom, there is a clear indication that their marriage and their relationship is falling apart.
Even from the start. I mean, there's sort of a harbinger of doom that appears. They have a big party at a Serbian restaurant, and there's this very glamorous, strange woman who comes over to Irina during the party, and she comes over to her and says, Moja sestra, which in Serbian means my sister. And so you immediately get the vibe like, oh, this is another one of them cat people. And she recognizes her based on sight or scent alone. And it at that point marks this gradual downfall, I should say. It's not, it's not so much that the movie immediately loses it. It manages to sustain that sort of conflict throughout until a really shocking ending.
There's another element here that feeds into that, and that is that Oliver has a friend at work, Alice, who he's like some kind of architectural drafting and stuff like that.
He designs ships.
And they work together, and they're very friendly. But eventually Alice tells him, look, I love you and I care about you. And I know that's not cool to say, but I'm going to tell you it. And Oliver has to kind of grapple with that, saying like, well, you know, Irina and I are growing distant and we're not physically. I love that the movie's very clever about how to get around the Hays Code by never saying these things outright, but the implication is so blatant.
Right. I mean, he doesn't have to say, I want to bang my wife, but he talks about the difference between the love that he feels for Irina and the thing that he shares with Alice, you know, and it's very clearly a love versus lust thing. You know, Oliver says he can't take his eyes off Irina. He wants to touch her when she's near. She has a warmth that pulls at him. He wants to bang her. But, you know, this character, Alice, who is definitely his friend, and we like her. Like, she's made to be very personable in the film. They could easily sort of make her the homewrecker type, you know, who's moving in on this man. But no, she's got a really natural and fairly positive and seems like a very healthy relationship with Oliver. You can see them together. Like, the movie makes the case for them being a good couple fairly early on. So when they get together and have chemistry, there's something that feels right about it. And when we come back to Irina's perspective, we also sympathize with her feeling hurt. So, like I said, the movie does a really good job with managing the perspectives of the characters.
No, and again, it's because now that the repression has had this effect on her marriage, she is rightly jealous, but it's also, well, you know, you can't kiss him and turn to a cat person. Of course, he's going to look to somebody else who will kiss him.
Yep.
And so this is when we start seeing Irina turn, where her passion, her repressed passion, becomes jealousy and anger. And this is where the horror of the movie really kicks into gear, as Alice begins being stalked by some unseen thing. And we haven't talked much about the filmmaking yet of Cat People. As we said, the director of this, Jacques Tourneur, did Curse the Demon, which is an exceptionally well-directed film. The same goes for Cat People. This is, at times, a bracingly gorgeous movie.
Sure, and it was shot relatively cheaply. I mean, most of the interior sets were reused from prior RKO films because they shot it on the RKO sound stages.
But they, as always, they understand the power of light and shadow when it comes to horror movies in particular, and they do a lot of really clever things with as far as figuring out how to use that to their advantage. For example, at one point, Irina goes to a psychiatrist,
Dr. Judd, whose quote opens the film.
Yes, and the way they stage this, where it's like he's got her under hypnosis, the entire room's dark and there's just a single spotlight, a round spotlight on her face. It's a dream image. It's so beautiful. And eventually we get an actual dream sequence of Irina's with some fun little animation.
Yeah, that was a really strikingly formalist sequence. I really wanted more of that kind of stuff in the movie because it does it so well. Ultimately, the movie does make its horrors a lot more concrete. You know, we do see, you know, a giant cat attacking a person eventually, but they do such a great job of holding off on that stuff. Eventually, Dr. Judd also decides to move in on Irina. He thinks that Irina's really hot, and that's really creepy. And he gets mauled to death by a giant cat, so he kind of gets his.
Yeah, but before that, I mean, these stalking Alice sequences, of which there's two in the movie, one where she's on a street and we don't see anything, we just hear steps that seem to be following her.
We do see Irina's shoes following her for a bit until she goes into a tunnel, and then Irina's feet kind of exit the scene.
Mm-hmm. But there's a great jump scare.
Oh man, Alice is still being followed, clearly. I mean, there's a sense that there is a presence there following her along this vacant street. And the zoo is nearby. They kind of imply the presence of the zoo near. And that moment when the bus pulls up, you know, when she's right next to the streetlight, is recognized as one of the great jump scares of cinema.
Mm-hmm.
It's freaking awesome.
It's great. And then later, Alice goes to like a local, you know, exercise club place where there's a pool, and she's taking it.
I love the woman at the front desk. Gee whiz.
Oh yeah, it's 1942. You gotta love it. And she's like, oh, yeah, I'm going to take a dip in the pool. But then before she does that, she thinks she hears something again following her. And she dives into the pool to kind of get away from it. And this entire sequence is completely framed from Alice's perspective, looking at the reflections of the water and the light on the walls around the pool. And we'll see it's kind of a shadowy shape moving around. It's so simple and all done with light, shadow, and sound. And it's still effectively creepy, almost 75 plus years later.
Oh yeah, they do a fantastic job of implying the presence of some monster in the shadows around the pool. This is another really fantastic use of minimal lighting by Tourneur. He does another really fantastic job, again, in a cat stalking scene with Alice, set in the interior of the office where Alice and Oliver work. There's a light table where they do their drafting, and it's used as a practical source of lighting in the scene, and it's awesome. It's really cool.
It's great. I love all of the lighting in this. One of my favorite moments, it's a small moment, but God, it hit me in the right way, is Irina is rejecting Oliver. They're in their kind of parlor or whatever in their apartment, and is telling him to go away and leave. And he leaves, and the camera cuts to behind her, and she scratches open the pad on the couch.
Mm-hmm.
So cool. Again, it's so simple, but with the music and the emotion of the scene, I should say Simone Simon kills in this movie. She's so good.
Her accent is so signature. She's French, so her accent, it definitely sounds French at times, but it's such a signature sound for this character. She also, oddly enough, played the voice of the strange woman in the restaurant.
Oh, okay. I just love that shot of her scratching the couch so much. It might be my favorite shot in the movie. But then, yes, the the Dr. Judd does advance on Irina, and she's like, all right, I'll give you what you want, and turns into a cat and mauls him. But I think is it before that when Oliver and Alice are attacked at their office?
Yeah, that scene with the light table that I was talking about is when Irina comes into the office, and they manage to fend her off by taking a T-square off the wall, which is like a big ruler with a sort of a cross piece that almost looks like a big crucifix when you hold it up. And so you get that silhouetted shot of him holding up the T-square as a weapon, but it looks like a man holding up a crucifix.
And he's literally saying, like, in the name of God, like, leave us. And it's like, no, don't let your horrible, lustful ways invade our perfect, puritanical Christian existence.
Yeah, well, I mean, the talk of the village being enslaved by these heathen Mamelukes coming in, talk of witchcraft and devil worship. So the cat is clearly a servant of Satan in this film. Fortunately, they do away with that kind of stuff in favor of some other things for the remake. But the mauling of Dr. Judd by the Irina cat is surprisingly violent for the time.
Yeah, it's all shot in shadow. I love what's essentially our transformation sequence, in which we see Irina's face and they shine all these lights into the lens and in her eyes. It is so magical, and it's the perfect balance of what it needs to be, which is beautiful and creepy.
Yeah, that is, I think, a great summation of the film. It does have, I think, the classic tragic ending. In another famous RKO film, King Kong has to fall from the top of the Empire State Building, and here our central character, Irina,
protagonist,
yeah, she is killed. She's injured in her fight with Dr. Judd, but the escaping panther, we know to be Irina, is run down and killed by a car in the street.
Because the Hays Code demands that whoever, I mean, I'm sure from their perspective, Irina is the villain, the evil doer. She must be punished. That's what the Puritanism demands. And by having to abide by that code, it makes it a tragedy. We feel terrible for Irina in the end. And I love that this movie was able to comment on these themes within the boundaries that it had to abide by, and in a way is mocking and picking apart those very boundaries. That is difficult to do from a creative standpoint. And Cat People 1942 more than pulls it off, while also just being a good, entertaining horror movie.
Yeah, and the fact that it's able to do so much with so little and be so almost kind of stage bound, where at times it feels like a stage play, it always remains compelling, even though this is the kind of movie that is structured around dialogue scenes where characters sit around and essentially discuss the themes of the movie. When you have a movie that has a psychiatrist in it, like Dr. Judd in this movie, it's like, okay, yeah, they're definitely going to be talking about the whole philosophy of, this movie's perspectives. Yeah, it's a stone cold classic for a reason. And if you've never seen Jacques Tourneur's 1942 masterpiece, Cat People, you owe it to yourself to see it. I feel like probably more of our audience has probably seen the remake, though, from, 82?
Most likely, because in 1982, Paul Schrader came around and decided, you know what, I'm going to remake Cat People, and all this sexual repression and tension and stuff, it's 1982. Let's just really put it all out there in the open.
Well, it is a pretty horny movie, and there is a definite aspect of the male gaze in this film that adds to its sleaziness.
Here's the thing. We're going to talk a lot about 1982's Cat People in a lot of ways, but I'm going to start off by saying this. It adds a character into the story whose name is Paul.
Mm-hmm.
I can't help but make a certain connection between that and the director of the movie, who is also an uncredited screenwriter for it.
Sure. So released in 1982, this has some big names in it. It's got John Hurd in it. It's got Malcolm McDowell. The lead is played by Nastasia Kinski, and she is the new Irina. She's called Irina, and the movie opens with her traveling to New Orleans. She has been summoned there by her brother Paul, played by Malcolm McDowell, and they're sort of looking to reconnect all these years later.
I'm going to stop you because you say the movie opens with that. No, it opens way weirder and frankly more interesting.
Yeah, but that's not plot stuff. The real opening, the first scenes that you see in the film is not plot. It's all sort of mood and backstory and fantasy. And I'll let you have that.
Oh, sure. I mean, it's setting up this new take on the Cat People, which is all done in this desert somewhere. It's undisclosed, I believe, throughout the movie. I don't know if they really nail it down to a particular region, but this is kind of our new introduction to this Cat People legend,
mm-hmm.
which seems to be about tying a woman to a tree and having a panther. Yeah. Go at it.
I mean, the panther eats her. I mean, they describe, there's literally a scene in the movie where Malcolm McDowell's character appears in a fantasy and explains what happens. Spoilers for a movie released in 1982. There is a scene where Paul appears to her in a dream and says, here's how our race of cat people was born. And so evidently the whole mythology of it is this ancient civilization of humans sacrificed their maidens to the big cats, and the souls of the maidens were in the big cats, and that created a race of cat people from the cat offspring. Sure, whatever.
Well, here's as a remake, this adds a new wrinkle by having the character of Paul and having him be Irina's brother, having them both be cat persons. And the idea that they put forward in this is that if you become passionate and try and make love with anybody that's not a cat person, you're going to turn into a cat. And the only way you're going to be able to turn back is if you kill.
It's a really interesting wrinkle in this movie. It adds a fair amount of conflict in this flick. I really like that structure.
Yeah, I'm gonna knock a few things off the list here, and then I'm gonna talk about the remake aspect specifically. So Paul adds this thing. It's like the only way you can have sex is to have sex with one of our own kind, and you won't transform. So Paul Schrader has decided to inject an incest story into this, and to be fair, while that is nasty, it's not without some thematic weight to it. It's gross, but it's not gross just to be gross.
Well, it's partially gross to be gross, but it's not only to be gross.
No, but what I like about Cat People 1982 is that from a remake standpoint, Cat People 1982 does a lot right. It's It's not just retreading the original movie. It has a take. It has a very different take on it. Simply adding a brand new character into the mix and having him be Irina's brother and changing up the dynamic of the movie in that sense is great. I really like that. There's a lot more in this. Oliver is not some shipbuilding guy. He works at the New Orleans Zoo and is one of the handlers for their big cat enclosure, just all of their animals, which is great. And actually ends up adding a little weight, I think, to the very end of the movie. And while there is still a romance between Irina and this version of Irina and Oliver, it's very different up to a point, which we'll get to.
Right.
But I also like that this being a 1982 movie and not having to be subjected to the same moral rigors as the 1942 one did. This Cat People is allowed to be really gory and really horny.
Yeah, I mean, this was conceived to be an effects film. You know, it's trying to execute everything in effects that the original couldn't, just due to the fact that it was a low-budget movie from 1944. So they do, you know, some big fake cat stuff in this. They do a lot of big real cat stuff too. There's a combination of cats that they had to film for this movie. So some of the stuff, you know, where there's this big black leopard, they did have to shoot with leopards, but leopards aren't trainable, but they
actually
did
shot with cougars.
Well, some of the stuff is shot with cougars and some of the stuff is shot with leopards.
Oh, okay. I thought it was all cougars.
Yeah, for the stuff that they had to have the cats on set with people and in the same shot with people, they would use cougars because they were safer, or I don't know if this is actually true, but the people handling the animals there felt that the cougars were safer, more trainable, and they painted the cougars black.
Yeah, they went full Beastmaster.
Exactly. Yeah, they went full Beastmaster, painted the cats black, and that's how you get certain shots of characters in the frame with these big cats. But some of the stuff where the cats didn't have to interact with the humans, they would use a leopard.
Oh, and it's that there's one, because I feel so mixed about this, because I like seeing live animals in movies, but then it's also like, no, these are wild animals that shouldn't be used for this reason.
Right.
But then then I see something like the most recent version of Call of the Wild, and I'm like, oh no, like I don't know, this is all weird. But there's a moment in this where there is one of the panthers is in a hotel room, and it's Paul who is transformed and killed a prostitute. And the next morning they find the panther in the room, and this panther is a real panther that's jumping around on this set. And it's like, oh man, I feel really uncomfortable.
Well, he didn't kill the prostitute. Because
that's right.
She escapes, and if he were to have killed her, he would have transformed back.
Great.
But instead, what he does, and there's this really gory gag, is he scratches her ankle.
Yes.
And in close up, you see the cat's paw, come out from under the bed and scratch her ankle, really, really nasty. And that shot she sees of the cat's tail flicking in and out from under the bed is like, ugh, it's really alarming.
I think its intention is slightly comedic.
Oh yeah, for sure.
But but yes, there's also, this movie's just allowed to be grosser because it's an effects film. So whenever Paul transforms, there's always this weird gooey viscera that's either on his body or left from where he transformed. And the first time we see this is when the prostitute, she sits down on the bed, and there's just this, I can only describe it, thank you, It's Always Sunny, for this, as a yuck puddle.
Yeah, it is a yuck puddle. I believe they made it out of gelatin and thread.
It's so, I hate looking at it, but that makes me kind of love it because it's genuinely repulsive. Mm-hmm. And that's that might be my pull quote for this movie. It's genuinely repulsive, because this Cat People can do so much more in terms of the content. Like, Nastasha Kinski is either nude or without a shirt on or without a bra on in some scenes for the majority of the movie. It is very much fetishizing her as a person on screen. And of course, reading that her and Schrader were likely romantically involved when this was going on, It's weird. And I'm not saying that as a good or bad thing. It's just weird.
It is weird. And, we have to recognize that this is sort of a common trend with a lot of well-regarded male directors, is that they'll take their young muse and they'll put them as the lead in the movie. Luc Besson has done this time and time again.
He's not the only one.
Yeah. So the fact that she is this movie's central character but doesn't feel like a proper protagonist is, I think, the biggest issue I have with Cat People 82. It's got a whole host of issues, to sort of be frank about it, but the fact that this movie kind of treats Irina like it's Barbie doll is like, yeah, that's the biggest pile of poop that this movie steps in.
In terms of comparison with the original movie, 1982 Irina is so much more passive. She's a much more passive protagonist than the Irina we saw in 1942. Literally, she has to depend on Oliver to get her a job at the zoo in the gift shop.
Mm-hmm.
Like, she's just come into the country and she's been waiting to see Paul, who she's only heard about all of her life. And I told you when I was watching this, I was like, this would probably be considered very, very uncool, especially if you proposed it today, considering the status of the original. But I kind of think this should have been a completely gender-flipped remake, because Paul is the far more interesting character.
Yeah, he is, and Malcolm McDowell plays him with the sort of expected level of sleaze. I mean, this is a movie sort of defined by its own sleaziness. It's not unaware of the fact that it's a sleaze fest. But that scene where Paul meets that blonde woman in the cemetery and then takes her back to a hotel room to have sex, and he seems genuinely regretful that he knows he's going to kill her.
Yeah, he tells her, he's like, I like you. And the way he says, like, I like you, it's so doomed.
Yeah.
And we discover things because eventually the police, are tracking it. They think that somebody owned this panther, and they're like, well, who owned this cat and who was taking care of it and why did it attack this woman and everything? And when it goes to live with, to be held in the zoo, it's actually Paul, and he's being imprisoned there. Later he says, like, I was in prison.
In order to get out, he has to kill Ed Begley.
Yes, he deep blue sees Ed Begley's arm, gives him the old Stellan Skarsgård chomp.
Rips that fucker right off.
And there's clearly, I will say this about Cat People because I genuinely think it's one of its best features. Schrader is a killer filmmaker and a strong stylist. This
Absolutely.
Is a great looking movie.
I mean, from the start, you really get this strong fantasy imagery, these big matte paintings and this sort of like really strikingly orange desert. It's almost like David Lynch's Dune. It's that kind of level of art design. I really enjoy this movie from that perspective. It's sort of its special sleaze art horror combination that I find appealing more in theory than in practice, but still fairly appealing in practice here. It's got a cool score by Giorgio Moroder.
Sure, and that killer David Bowie single, like we referenced. But the thing is, like, you can be art horror, art gore, and stuff like that, and do that poorly. I've seen those movies.
Yep.
The thing is, Cat People's not done poorly. Schrader is a very good director and has a very good sense of the frame and what he wants to do with it. And again, like I say, what he wants to evoke in a particular scene. And his cinematographer, John Bailey, absolutely kills it. I mean, like I say, this is a very, very good looking movie. However, all of this stuff where it's like, okay, Paul, I meant to say that when the police get involved and they go and investigate Paul's house, they find this basement dungeon, which is just all these cages and there's human bones as remains and stuff. And then that was the moment where I'm like, I kind of wish that we had Paul as the same, because Paul is the real tortured protagonist that the original Irina was.
Yeah, I mean, he's not a perspective character in the same way. Like, he's so immediately creepy. You know, when he brings Irina over to his house the first night that she's there, and they're looking at all these sort of artifacts from their childhood. Evidently, their parents were two people who ran a circus, and there's all these sort of circus artifacts in this cabinet. He is practically like kissing her earlobe from behind. It's like, ugh, ew,
well, and then later there's a wonderful, simple effect shot where they film the scene backwards to have it seem like Paul walks into Irina's bedroom as she's sleeping and jumps up nimbly on the end of the bedpost, and it's a wonderful, very simple reverse effect. But again, it's like he's just sitting there creepily leering at her. I can't help but believe that the fact that this had to be a remake, that Schrader and the credited screenwriter Alan Ormsby felt that they had to make this from Irina's perspective, that this was expected to be a sexy kind of kinky movie. And I find Paul to be, even though if the movie focused on him, he'd be a more kind of standard villain than obviously Irina was in the original, it still seems like he's the one that's more interesting in having the more complicated journey, and then the movie kills him.
Yeah, and it feels incredibly anticlimactic for the movie to kill Paul at this point, because it's the combination of Alice, this movie's Alice, played by Annette O'Toole.
Who's great. I love Annette O'Toole.
Sure. And John Hurd, who plays Oliver, who's not Oliver Reed in this one. They call him Oliver Yates. But they shoot a shotgun at him and he falls out a window and dies. It's very Ginger Snaps. Shoot him, dead. That's it.
And then the movie goes full Rob Zombie Halloween. And when I say that, what I mean is that it was doing its own original thing. Love it or hate it, it had its own unique take on the material and was approaching a remake the way you should, in which it's like, just take the concept and do a new spin on it, and keep the things that people will recognize, but do your take on it. But after Paul dies, then, like Rob Zombie's Halloween, the movie becomes a fast forward, almost shot for shot remake of the original film. Right.
And when Paul was killed, at the point in the film that he's killed, like, there's still a substantial amount of film after Paul's death. This is like a 2-hour movie compared to like 73 minutes. But Paul represents clearly everything that Irina fears about herself and her own condition. And so for her to look at her dead brother's body and cry out in pain, ah! And then the movie goes into this section where she's mourning her lost pervert asshole serial killer brother. And she decides to get on a train and leave New Orleans. I'm like, the hell is happening? She decides to go to Virginia because it's like that's as far as her money will get her. Mm-hmm. But as she's on the train, she has this dream about returning home to the orange desert that we saw in the prologue of the film. And Paul is there, and he tells her all the lore about how the cat people came to be, and he tells her the rule, before we can become human again, we have to kill. And after that, we transition back to New Orleans, where we're following Alice for a couple scenes, and the movie just repeats the scenes from the original that were like the signature suspense scenes that everybody thinks is so classic. It's like
they even replicate the bus scare.
Yeah, it's a bold and poor choice to
it sucks.
Bring, especially the pool scene. It's done so beat for beat, so rote. It's like, well, okay, Annette O'Toole is topless in this one. It's the only difference. Fuck you.
And that's where it feels. It's like, well, you're doing this already cheaply, but now the horniness doesn't feel inventive. It just feels like, oh, come on, man. Like,
well, we completely lose Irina as a perspective character at this point too.
Right.
So, and that's a bummer, especially seeing like how much of the movie is left. So after Paul is dead, the movie just sort of meanders from scene to scene. There's no particular conflict motivating this. The romance is not functional between Irina and Oliver, and it almost feels like an extended epilogue after Paul's death. Mm-hmm. Like, I have no idea why she returns to New Orleans at all. And Nastassja Kinski, like, as good as she is in the rest of the film, her as like the evil, scary version of Irina doesn't work, because we see her as this innocent little girl, whereas the Irina in the original film was way more complicated, like way more interesting.
There's one good scary Irina thing in this movie, and it's when there's this, like, I don't know, some little cabin or something that Oliver has
Out in the bayou.
Yeah, on the bayou. And they go and stay there one night, and during the night, like, Irina gets up and, of course, completely strips nude, because Paul Schrader, and walks through.
Who doesn't want to walk
bayou.
around naked in the woods at least once in their life? I mean, come on.
Right, but then there's a cut back to where John Hurt is in the bed because they were sleeping together, not having sex, obviously, but sleeping together. And he wakes up and she's not there, and he looks up and she's got blood. She's standing above the bed and she's got blood on her mouth, and the bedside light illuminates her face, and she just goes, "Don't look at me," and hits the light.
Yeah, it's a freaky shot. Yeah,
it's a nightmare moment. It's really good.
And there are some things like the prosthetics they eventually put on her when we see her big transformation. Those are cool. Like I said, she comes back to New Orleans. She tries to stalk Alice, and the movie replicates those classic scenes beat for beat for some stupid reason. And then she goes and hunts down Oliver at his house, and they have sex for some reason. And as expected, she transforms. And I mean, some of the transforming gags in this are cool. They're not of the quality that you would expect from Rick Baker or Rob Bottin, but the transformation effects are pretty decent.
They're cool, but I would say this is like, there's less than 10 minutes left in the movie.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, I guess for an effects film, if you're going to make this the build to your transformation scene, you need to knock it out of the park. And I'd say this is like a 7 out of 10, 8 out of 10.
Mm-hmm.
So it feels a little deflating, even though, like you say, I think some of the stuff in there is cool, and the actual prosthetics and pieces and stuff that they use are of good quality. It's just not the kind of payoff that you expect when there's less than 10 minutes in the movie. And it's like,
yeah,
because there's good hints at cool transformation stuff. Like earlier when Paul is about to transform, he pulls his fist up and we see just the tips of cat claws come out of his knuckles, like Wolverine style. It's
cool. It's a definite nod to the sort of success American Werewolf had with its sort of Change-O hands and Change-O heads. You know, it's a little less ostentatious, but it's still good effects and creepy, sufficiently just icky. So after Irina transforms, she doesn't kill Oliver, but she runs out and is running around in the street. As a panther, she's cornered by cops. And of course, Loverboy shows up, and this is the ending of American Werewolf in London, where the lover is looking on as the wild were animal is cornered by the cops, and they're going to shoot it. But because this happens on a bridge, the cat leaps off and into the river. In order to resolve her cat form, Irina kills a friend of Oliver's, this dude who lives out in the bayou that we meet earlier. And for some reason, after she kills his friend, Oliver decides to have sex with her again. And in this time, it's the most openly fetishistic one, where he ties her to the bed.
Well, doesn't she say to him, like, kill me, and if you're not going to kill me, then make love to me?
Maybe. It sounds like something this movie would say.
Yeah. Well, because the reveal of this is that she is going to stay in cat form and now is going to be pretty much cared for by Oliver. And, when we saw the panther before, which was Paul, he was always, aggressive and growling, and now this panther, the Irina panther, is much more docile. And I don't know, like, I like that the movie doesn't kill Irina in the end from a remake perspective. I think that's another interesting wrinkle.
Sure.
And it's like, okay, yeah, she gets to be a cat person, be her true self, but I don't know, like, having her basically be caged up and under the care of Oliver. There's so much to read into that feels wrong.
It's a bit more of a fairy tale ending instead of a tragic ending. but it doesn't feel right. Again, like I said, the movie treats Irina as its Barbie doll, doesn't give her the proper level of agency in the story. She doesn't feel fully autonomous, and that I think is just a huge sin. And it's the worst thing about the film. The second worst thing about the film is that after Paul dies, the film kind of falls apart into this structuralist rehash of so many things that were good about the original. And while I like the overall veneer of sleaze that this movie has, I think that's interesting and it sets it apart. There's also some stuff about it that just hasn't aged all that well. So while I do like Cat People 1982, we've criticized it heavily, but I think fairly. Like, this is a movie that I think overall I like a lot. Like, you can't beat that scene where they're dissecting the Paul panther after it dies, and they're cutting it open, and this deformed human arm flops out of the panther's corpse. It's such an incredible shock moment.
It's great. I wish the movie was more committed to that stuff, because when it happens, when it decides to let the gore loose and the effects loose, it hits, I would say, 90% of the time.
Sure. Yeah, it's a good effects film.
It's good. I like Malcolm McDowell, because come on, Malcolm McDowell. And I said it before, it's bears repeating. I think the direction and the look of the movie are stellar. I think this is a really handsome movie, and I think it's one of the reasons why it's maintained a small cult following over the years, is because it's a well-made movie in that regard. And I wish it had just committed to being a very different take on the material plotting-wise, because when it shifts and it's like, oh yeah, we have to remake these things from the original, it pretty much lost me.
Yeah, I was surprised at how hard it dropped the ball after Paul's death. It had been a few years since I'd seen it, but now I kind of see like why I didn't remember it all that well. So it's pretty clear that in this versus, the original Cat People wins very handily.
Yeah, paws down. It's the big winner. I mean, I had seen the 1982 Cat People as well. I think I've seen this, had to have potentially been my third time seeing this movie. And when I was telling you about it, I'm like, I can never remember a lot of this movie. And I think now I know why. It's not I can't call 1982 Cat People a bad movie.
I can't either, but it's not an entirely successful film. I will remember more of 1982 Cat People now, but it's only because I've seen the original now. And
Right.
I understand just how much of the original the remake grabs and just remakes beat for beat in an unfortunate way. And that was the part of the film that I, oddly enough, just didn't remember all that well. You know, all the stuff where Paul is the killer and the villain. I was like, okay, that's what I remember about the film. Because it's unique. It really sets itself apart doing that stuff. And it's not like Paul's any particular great character or a likable character. He's not a character that I was craving seeing on screen all the time. But the film was just more interesting when he was in it.
But looking at this for our theme month, Were Women Month, we had Ginger Snaps last week, which was dealing with a very specific transformative time in a woman's life. This week, we have clearly dealing with passions that I think making it cats, which I don't think this is too bold to say. Cats are often looked at as kind of feminine avatars.
And women are seen as feline creatures frequently.
Right. And both of these movies are talking about what happens when women, completely give in to their feline nature, to the point where they would actually change into giant cats that can maul and destroy men at will. Obviously, with Cat People 82, we have the wrinkle of, well, there's also a were man. And the were man is the really villainous one. I like that in both versions of Cat People, as is often the case with characters that have been subjected to some kind of transformative curse, that this is something, a side of themselves that they're wrestling with. And I think this is kind of the most direct link to the more typical werewolf idea, which is usually represented with masculine characters, which is like, oh, it's the animalistic side. But for men, the werewolf, it's like, well, that means it's unrestrained violence and incredible strength and all this stuff. But with women, at least in these cat people movies, it's directly linked to sex.
Yes, and particularly in the first film, it's a comment about the concept of hysteria, and I think the movie has a perspective that says like this whole idea of women being afraid of their own emotions is offensive. Like the movie has a take on that, which is pretty cool. The fact that they had to change the second film to be less about hysteria by the inclusion of Paul is, I don't know, it's a bit of a comparison between the sexes and how passion manifests, at least in stereotypes and archetypes. But the fear of transformation, becoming something you can't control, is something both Ginger Snaps and Cat People do very, very well.
Yeah, I would say the 1982 version's also, I think, getting more specific about your feelings of sexual perversion. Mm-hmm. Like having this incest relationship, which of course incest is considered this incredible ultimate taboo. And that being really, it's like, well, that's the only avenue you have to have what could potentially for us be a healthy sexual relationship, but it's really dark and fucked up.
Yeah, fear of your own kinks, fear of your own desires.
Right.
What is normal?
Yes. And I think that's really fertile thematic ground to tread, but I don't think Cat People 1982 does it to the fullest extent it could, especially in comparison to the 1942 version and what it's got on its mind.
Fully agreed. All right. If you wanted to find more films kind of like this in a similar vein, you would go to The Shelf. The Shelf is where we pull off films for recommendation and sometimes substitution for the movies we're talking about on the show. Drew, what are you pulling off the shelf this week to pair with Cat People?
Well, before I do that, I do want to recommend that our listeners go to genrevision.com and comment on the post for this episode with their own shelf picks for the episode, and we'll feature them in next week's episode. For this one, this is kind of easy, but I'll take any opportunity I can to promote these movies. I wanted to do another pair of remakes that I actually think both of these are great. This is The Fly from 1958 and The Fly from 1986. Always David Cronenberg's Fly from 86 is lauded as one of the greatest remakes. I mean, not just in horror, but in general. And David Cronenberg's Fly is an excellent, excellent masterpiece. I am willing to hear arguments that it's his best film. I may even stand with you on those arguments. But I really want to advocate for people to see the original 1958 The Fly. I love that movie so much. And of course, another connection for the shelf pick is that these are characters that are transforming into things, this time through acts of science rather than supernatural curses or anything. They're both great effects films for their time. They're both
supernatural curses.
Yes. They're both great effects films for their time. I think they're both exceptionally well-made films. The Fly 58 is such a beautiful Technicolor movie. It's gorgeous. I love staring at that movie. And I think it's a movie that's kind of been overshadowed by its remake, whereas in the inverse, I think, is true with Cat People. I think the original one has cemented itself as a tried and true classic, and the 82 one is kind of a cult classic, I would say at this point.
Sure.
But I really want to advocate, if people out there have not seen the original 1958 Fly, please get on that. I am upset that I could not afford the giant box set collection of all the Fly movies that Scream Factory put out recently.
Yeah, me too.
Because I want it just for the 1958 version. I mean, I love all the other movies, and I've written about my love of The Fly too as well. But yeah, I think that it's an example where the original and the remake in certain ways complement each other really well. And they're very different movies, even though they're tackling the same material. But how about you, Travis? What are you going to pull off the shelf for our Cat People versus episode?
Well, one of the first shots of Cat People is a quote from the fictional Dr. Lewis Judd in the movie. And the quote says, "Even as fog continues to lie in the valleys, so does ancient sin cling to the low places, the depressions in the world consciousness." And that comes from Dr. Judd's The Anatomy of Atavism. And atavism is essentially describing a regression to like an ancient form. And there is a movie that I'm thinking of from the 80s that you maybe have guessed already that hits on exactly that, and it's Altered States, directed by the great Ken Russell and starring the fantastic William Hurt. And I think his first big feature film role. This flick's pretty cool. I don't know if it's great, but there's a lot of great things about it. It's about a scientist who is studying the limits of the human mind and using techniques like hallucinatory drugs and psychedelics and sensory deprivation to explore what happens when the limits of consciousness are reached, and what kind of states consciousness can exist in. And spoiler alerts for Altered States, he eventually regresses to a caveman type form and goes on a rampage. Hey, Atavism, how you doing?
Yeah, I feel like Altered States is one of those movies that probably a lot of people haven't seen, but they've seen every more popular thing that ripped it off.
Sure, like Stranger Things.
Yeah, Stranger Things has direct references to homages to Altered States. No, but Altered States, it's Ken Russell, so it's weird. I mean, if people haven't seen some of his stuff, Lair of the White Worm, Gothic, The Devils, the infamous The Devils, he like Schrader's film is willing to go to some very weird, uncomfortable, twisted places.
Yeah, Altered States is actually my favorite Ken Russell film.
Okay. I have to revisit it. You wrote it up a long time ago, and I meant to do it then, and I haven't. And I saw that movie way too young, but elements of it have refused to leave my brain.
There's some hallucinatory stuff in the film that is just so striking. I'll never forget it. Anyway, I can't recommend it enough. It's definitely a cult classic that I think is a little bit better and more effective than 1982's Cat People. It's definitely more of a thinking watcher's movie, though. I heartily recommend it.
Well, we got to do our listener shelf picks for last week's episode on Ginger Snaps. Mr. Milksteak recommended Tom Holland's Fright Night, a movie that they spent a lot of time excited to see as a kid. It's a suburban horror movie featuring another genre staple, vampires. Yeah, man, Tom Holland's Fright Night is a classic for a reason. I think it's one of the best vampire movies of the 80s, bar none.
Very fun movie.
Eric Fuchs was very cute, in which he says, let's imagine another more mainstream take on Ginger Snaps themes. What if, say, Disney took a swing at struggling with controlling changing bodies, sisters with an unhealthy relationship, and emerging dark powers symbolizing sexual awakenings? You get Frozen, which is his pick this week, mostly because his other idea, Jennifer's Body, was way too obvious. You're cute, Eric. We like you. You made a good through line argument there. I'll give you that.
He did. I'll give it to him.
Yeah. When I was scrolling through the comments and I saw Frozen, I was like, oh, the Adam Green movie? Because I'm probably the only person that thinks of Frozen, the Adam Green movie.
You and Adam Green.
Yes. Stephen Nisbell's shelf pick said it might be a kind of boring pick. No, Stephen, we love all the picks you guys give us. And he says he's going to go for Ginger Snaps 2. It picks up where the other one left off, with Bridget starting to turn and doing her best to stop the transformation. It's got some cool practical makeup effects on Bridget at the end and ends on a bummer. I think I said this when we did the episode. I know I saw that movie and I vaguely remember it. And after doing the first Ginger Snaps, I'm like, maybe I need to at least try and revisit the sequel.
I need to revisit it. I remember liking it when it came out, but I'll admit it's a strange flick. Very stylistically and, mood wise, just different than the original, which is cool. I like that they didn't try to replicate exactly what the original did. Definitely a new spin on it, which is cool.
And last but not least, Jetpack Jesus said, my initial thought was Heather's, which came up during the episode, but instead I'm going to go with what Alexa came up with on my Fire TV stick, An American in Paris, which he says, after I finished Ginger Snaps, I immediately searched to see if An American Werewolf in London is available. It's not, But Alexa did tell me that people who watched it also watched An American in Paris. I get how that happened given the sequel, which is An American Werewolf in Paris, but it's just too funny not to share. Which he then left a screenshot where it recommended a bunch of Gene Kelly movies and Code of Silence starring Chuck Norris. God bless the algorithm.
Just for good measure, right?
Yeah, so I thought that was a very fun little comedic shelf pick. I loved that. Thank you, Jetpack Jesus. Let's do some currently consuming.
Nom, 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 nom.
Travis, what's been on your plate?
Not a whole lot, actually. I've had a fairly busy week when it comes to stuff I had to do, but when it comes to stuff that I wanted to consume for leisure purposes, there was one thing I picked up that's brand new this week, and it's called Invisible Choir. It's a podcast, and I like true crime podcasts. I don't listen to a lot of them, but there are certain ones that really click with me. One of the ones that I started listening to and it really clicked with me for a little while was a podcast called Sword and Scale. And as I was listening to more episodes over the course of the couple weeks that I really liked it, I started to get the sense it was like, this host is getting really weird. I won't call him out by name, but the host of that show eventually revealed himself to not pass the asshole test. He failed the asshole test rather miserably when he started acting like a real asshole to people online. And I thought, well, shit, I don't want to listen to this asshole's podcast. So I stopped. And I've only listened to a few other fairly good true crime podcasts since then. And then I saw a recommendation, I believe it was on Reddit this week, for a substitution for Sword and Scale. And they recommended Invisible Choir. And it's pretty much a similar format to Sword and Scale, and that it relies upon a lot of real audio collected from cases, whether it be 911 calls or police interrogation audio or courtroom audio. It's a pretty good show if you like that sort of grisly true crime stuff, which I do in small amounts. But yeah, it's like it's nice to find a substitution for a show where you're like, man, I really like that show except for that one asshole who makes that show, and therefore the show sucks now. But to find a better version of it made by a better person, it's like, oh, how pleasant.
I hope they continue to pass the asshole test.
So far, so good. So okay. We shall see. Okay.
Well, on my end, I wrote up a movie for my weekly column at Bloody Disgusting, which is We Love 90s Horror. I decided to hunt down a movie that I saw. I wanted to see it in theaters when it came out, but my parents were not going to subject themselves to it, so I eventually saw it when it hit video. This is Bats. It's just Bats.
I prefer the official title in my head, which is Bats from 1999.
Yes, Bats from 1999. Written by John Logan, which I did not know when I started watching it.
Yeah, screenwriter of Alien Covenant.
And a whole lot more, including Martin Scorsese movies.
Yeah. Didn't he also do a Bond? Wasn't he credited with a Bond?
I think he's on Skyfall and Spectre. So Bats, you can go read my article. We'll link to it in the post for this. But I was pleasantly surprised with Bats. It's about as B-movie as a B-movie can get, but it knows it and embraces it, and I really have an affinity for movies that do that. It doesn't have, especially being a post-Scream movie, I was really afraid there was going to be a bunch of cheeky attempts at meta humor for the creature feature, but it's not. It's just it's a creature feature, and there's, I would say, about a 50-50 delineation of the effects works between CGI bats and practical bats done by K&B.
Mm-hmm. And
the practical bats are pretty cool. They get extreme character close-ups at times, which is incredible. It's these real puppet bats that are giving performance.
Now, Lou Diamond Phillips is the lead in this, right?
Yeah, LDP, star of Metal Tornado, is in this.
It's the last thing I saw him in.
Yeah, it's the only Travis had to review Metal Tornado on DVD, which is the kind of movie you would think Bats would be. It's like this direct-to-video, probably premiered on the Sci-Fi Channel, disposable thing. But Bats, it was a theatrical release, and my goodness, it's, I want to say 80-something minutes and change before the credits hit. It has fun. It's trying to have fun without being at its own expense. It's not a perfect movie. I think some of the directing and editing choices kind of hinder it, especially in the violence area. But I think they knew that because they were trying to get a PG-13.
Oh, bummer.
Yeah, there's still some surprisingly gory stuff. There's a autopsy sequence in the first 10 minutes or something. It's an overhead view, and it's like, yep, just here's somebody's open gutty works. And it's like, whoa.
It's okay, he's dead.
Yeah. But yeah, Bats, I really liked it. I think it's one of those movies I don't know. I would assume it does not have a Region 1 Blu-ray release. I think it's one that's slowly but surely being forgotten. It's not available on streaming anywhere. And that's a shame because it's not a bad time. It put a smile on my face. And as I said in my article, we could all use one of those right now. So Bats, go check it out. But let's wrap things up with our
Comment of the week.
And we're going to come back to Jetpack Jesus, whose comment says, "Thanks once again for turning me on to another movie I had never watched before. Horror isn't really my bag, though I do love good horror movies, and Ginger Snaps is definitely one of those. It's just not a genre that draws my attention for whatever reason. On that note, thanks for reminding me. I still need to check out It Follows and Zathura. Anyway, I had never heard of Ginger Snaps, which is really a shame because it came out only 3 months after my 16th birthday and just before I started 10th grade. I wish I saw it then when these characters were my peers." I'm glad you got to see it regardless, Jetpack, and that you enjoyed it. And this is pretty much the highest compliment we can get on this show, is that we turned somebody on to something. If one person watches a movie that they may not have discovered or gone out of their way to see because they listen to our show, it's magical. It's absolutely magical.
Especially when the movie's as good as Ginger Snaps.
It's true. And I'm glad that Jetpack had such a good time with it. So thank you so much, Jetpack, and thank you to everybody who watches these movies, to be able to listen to the episodes. I know we've had a number of comments recently and over the years that say that, and it means the world to us, y'all. It really does. And we're going to be doing it again next week, and we hope that you'll come back for the next edition of Where Women Month, when we're doing Species. Which oh boy, I can't wait to talk about one very particular thing about that movie that really is not about the movie.
Okay.
That's going to be my tease for next week. So make sure to come on back, and we'll be talking about Species, the ultimate teaser movie of look, you want to see boobies. So we'll be back next week with Species. As always, we want to thank you all for listening. I'm Drew Deach.
I'm Travis Newton.
And we'll see you next week.
Right here on Genre Vision.